Should we get going?
Let's do it.
Introduce yourself, sir.
So hey everyone, Jeff Zastek. I am with VMware. Some people call me or claim I look like Heisenberg from Breaking Bad, but I'm a systems engineering manager in the Ohio Valley area, so I cover Ohio. So I feel sorry for everyone sitting here. You're about to be, a manager is going to tell you how to virtualize SQL Server databases and Oracle databases, so I apologize. But we like to have fun, so thank you for showing up. We really do appreciate it. Hope everybody had a good time last night. So.
You know, the other thing, the first time we gave this presentation, and we keep updating it, I put that slide in there without telling them the picture. Yeah. I changed the picture out. This is a slide about me. I've been doing this for a very long time. I started at Oracle version 3. I'm a past president of International Oracle Users Groups. I was one of the people who got in a room to start the Professional Association of SQL Server, recognized Oracle ACE, recognized SQL Server MVP, recognized vExpert. I don't claim to know it all because there's a lot of things I don't know, but I certainly have an opinion and I'm not afraid to share it. And if you haven't figured out where I'm from, then you don't recognize probably one of the worst accents you'll ever have or one of the best accents you'll ever have. And what always gives me away is chowder and lobster. So, Boston boy here.
Get in the car.
Yeah, park your car at Harvard Yard. I have to think about it. And then, it's funny, sometimes you're in Boston and you'll hear people like go, do I sound like that? So this is absolutely a shameless plug. Take it for what it is. We're authors. We're very proud. We're also very proud that our newest book that I worked with Jeff on sold out at the bookstore. It's the only one that sold out, so thank you for anyone that purchased the book.
We do want to introduce our co-author,
please.
Mike Webster. So if anyone, definitely follow him on Twitter. This guy is amazing, an amazing blog site. So
yeah, we'll actually point out his blog site because it's really an excellent place for information. So we're going to do something different here. Originally we had an Oracle presentation, we had a SQL Server presentation, and then what we realized was it's the same issues. It's just two dogs fighting over the same bone, and that the things you're going to do pretty much work across the board and will work for any business critical apps. So if you're running SAP, you're running Exchange, I would argue that the foundation we're going to talk about will work for you.
And so really what we want to start off with is this notion of, or the analogy of when you're driving down the road and you're on your cell phone using your Bluetooth hands-free device, because it's illegal to talk on the text while you drive. Do you care about what cell towers your phone is connected to as you're going down the road? Right? I don't. Well, I kind of do. I'm on AT&T, but that's a different story. So. But the idea is as I switch from tower one to tower, towers down the road, that's just infrastructure in the background. It's doing its job, right? So if I look at it from a database perspective, as long as I've been given the infrastructure that I need and the amounts that I need it and the resources are what I need when I need them and in the amounts that I need them, should I care where I run? Right, so that's kind of what we want to get to when we start moving databases onto a vSphere infrastructure, is we want to build a trust between the infrastructure and the application. It's going to be, this is what I need to run, and I'm going to deliver this from an infrastructure perspective. And we need to have that communication. Uh-oh.
I'm getting tired of this. I really am. Do we get anybody? Why do you get this? Anybody know the number one reason that causes the blue screen or whatever?
You're using Windows.
Ah, good answer.
If I had a book, I'd give it to you. Give me your business card. We'll see what we can do. Okay.
By the way, that's an interesting thing. We're actually slowing down. In my career, it's never been about the best technology that wins. Oracle was not the best database back then. Oracle was late to the game with stored procedures. Right? It's never been about the best technology. CPM was a better operating system than the early versions of Microsoft's operating system. Think about that. It's never about the technology, and always keep that in mind. It's really, in fact, Oracle really took over the industry when it figured out that people buy databases. They don't buy databases, they buy applications. And then the database comes along. But what's the number one reason you get this besides being on the Microsoft Windows platform? Absolutely driver. Ding, ding, ding. The man wins a prize, but we ran out of prizes. So the check's in
You
the
have
mail,
our
as they say.
eternal respect.
Right? So when you virtualize, you have a minimum set of drivers that are all vetted against each other. That is impossible for any vendor to do outside a virtualized platform.
Yeah, remember when you install VMware tools, your video driver, your network driver, your storage driver, all those drivers come in with VMware tools. Those are all tested against each other prior to them being installed. Think about your physical servers. Is your network vendor certifying their driver or testing their driver with the HBA in the server? Or is that you doing that for them? Right?
Right? And then I always like to point out that when the CFO and the CEO figure out that you can get 60% reduction in CapEx, 30% reduction in operating expense, they're going to push you to go down this path. And so I always say to the DBAs, don't fight it, because companies are looking at ways to save money, and virtualization represents a way to save money and at the same time maintain quality. And those, I think, are very realistic numbers.
So one of the advantages of virtualizing a database is this ability to add resources on the fly if you need them, right? So this is one option. So if at the end of a month-end processing, you need the ability to add a CPU or add memory to a SQL server, you have the ability to do that. And that's what these charts are showing here. That gap you see in your upper left, that's when the SQL DBA enters the @reconfigure command, so that SQL can start sending threads to the new CPU, right? We'll see here with memory, right? As long as your min-max settings are correct, when you add memory to the server, SQL will see it and start automatically adding, taking advantage of the memory. Just remember, Mike, if you can go back one.
Sure.
This setting inside vSphere can only be toggled with the VM powered off. So if you have talked to your DBA and said, hey, at the end of the month, if we need to add a CPU, we can, and this isn't set correctly ahead of time, you will be shutting down the database to bring this up. And also make sure you have the right licenses at the OS level and SQL level. And I'll give you a hint, it's not standard.
Yeah, and just so that the Oracle people don't feel left out of the room, same sort of things apply. Interesting thing about an Oracle, right? The SGA gets, right, the init.or, it reaches out, it figures out all its parameters at startup, so you can't dynamically change them without bringing the database back down. And so then there's a school of thought, well, maybe I'll just oversize it. I'm not a proponent of that. You should just size the SGA properly. You're in a shared resource environment. And so you kind of have to take those things into account, that even though you might give the VM more memory, the database isn't necessarily going to take full advantage of it right away. Right? And then the thing that I liked as a DBA was standardization. When I was at Children's Hospital years ago in Boston, we maintained Oracle on Linux, Unix, Windows. We had a site-wide license across the hospital. It was everywhere. And I was always trying to fight to get standardization, and I had a team of about 6 DBAs, and we never could accomplish that. In a virtualized environment with the templates and whatnot, this is possible. And so you really can bring up the quality of how you manage the environment. Any resource, anytime in the pool. This is, you can look at it later, but it just demonstrates that once you get on the path of virtualization, it's like being a little bit pregnant, right? What's the thing about being a little bit pregnant? There's no such thing as a little bit pregnant. You either are or you aren't. Well, when you get on the virtualization path, you're going to want to do more of it because of the inherent high availability features. They're a natural. They're a DBA's best friend. This is a great chart. Look at it later. We need to update this one a little bit. But basically, these are trigger points of when, hey, if you're going to take a picture, we want to get in it. I want to be remembered. All right? So then the question I always say to people, anybody think their database is too big to virtualize? Absolutely. Are you an Oracle DBA? I could tell. Because Oracle DBAs are always like, my database is too big to virtualize. Them is fighting words.
They probably don't even make hardware available for your database, do they? Right?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I have to ask you, is your database an 8 terabyte database? Or big? Oh, now you got me now. Because usually I get the answer of, oh, I'm smaller than that. So this is an example of a very big database being virtualized. 8 terabyte database, 8.8 billion rows, 52 million transactions per day, 79,000 IOPS. This is from the company. This is not from me, right? 40,000 named users, and yes, it's virtualized, and yes, everything about it got better when they virtualized it. And we actually have stats, if they're not in the back, You can send me an email or a Twitter, and I'll send you the data behind how everything operated. But it was done correctly, and it was also done on the latest hardware, which had all the chips to make virtualization run better. But, all right? And so I challenge you, and I say, except for you, you got me on this one, first time.
She's a troublemaker. Isn't
Yeah, yeah. Hey, security. Right?
Is this a plant? What's going on here?
So this is an interesting benchmark that was done, and you can read the details of the benchmark later. What's not important, what is important out of this is, as they scaled up native versus virtualized, what you saw was about a 5% overhead factor. And in fact, they also did this with, if I remember right, an Oracle rack. And what you're seeing is that native, bare metal, right, had a slight advantage over a virtualized infrastructure. No arguments. But it didn't get all the advantages that a virtualized infrastructure brought with it. And then I always say at the bottom, if you don't have at least 5% wiggle room in your environment, then one busy day you're done. So usually that 5% should be a non-issue. This is another test you can read later, but basically what they did is they attempted to vMotion everything all at once. It was like they just decided to go crazy with it, and they did it with an Oracle RAC database. An Oracle RAC database is active people. It's as bad as it gets, nothing broke. And I don't know of any other hypervisor that you could do that with where it wouldn't break. And this one is one of my favorites, which is we had a company out of the, well, I can't tell you where they are, but out of the United States, so you can guess. You got 1 out of 50 states to guess.
And no, it's not NASA.
And they monitored medical equipment, and failure was not an option. And they were having huge performance problems, and we identified a problem with the BIOS setting of the box where they couldn't use more than 50% of the available CPU. And we just wanted to reboot the box to get everything correct. And every time we asked the customer, the database could never go down. So then I got involved, and I'm looking at the infrastructure and go, this isn't a redundant infrastructure. They're on a standalone machine. Single point of failure across the board. And I sat back and I sat down with the person and I said, listen, does management believe you can never go down? Yep. Well, you better sit down with them and explain that that infrastructure won't support it. And they either need to buy the equipment to support this, but if they choose not to buy it when it goes down, you can't guarantee it'll only be down for 5 minutes. And so that begs the question, right? What are management expectations versus the capabilities of the infrastructure in place? There's that elephant in the room, and you better have that conversation. You absolutely better have that conversation, or you're doing the business of justice. So really, and then the other question is, anybody have an idea why I could only use half the CPU settings? I found this interesting. A really easy one, too. They had the energy saving settings set on. Yeah, absolutely. That was the default of the box. Nobody ever thought to change it. Yeah. So the point is, here's something that was artificially throttling. Right? So if your processor supports it, you are talking, this is not about saving energy, this is about getting performance. Jeff?
Yeah, and so what we found is, traditionally virtualizations come up through the IT teams, through tier 2 type infrastructure, and is now starting to get on in a lot of organizations that tier 1 infrastructure. But databases have always sat on tier 1 infrastructure. They've always sat on hardware, the mythical hardware that doesn't even exist because, right, my database is so big and so powerful. But the idea is what we've seen a lot of customers do, and a lot of this presentation too, I just want to say, when Mike and I did this, there's lots of versions of Oracle, lots of versions of SQL, lots of versions of vSphere out there, and so these recommendations and a lot of this stuff is a starting point, right? And we're going to talk about areas where customers have fallen down, scraped an elbow, bumped a knee type thing, or you can reverse that, right? Bumped a knee, scraped it, whatever. But the idea is, customers have picked up these databases in the physical world that were sitting on tier 1 infrastructure and moved them into the virtual world, right? And so they may be going from, fiber channel array to maybe a less performant array, and all of a sudden SQL doesn't perform, right? So, maybe it was backed with a certain number of spindles or a speed of disks or whatever in production, tier 1, and now we've moved it to a different set of back end, and the performance is different, right? And of course, that's our fault. So
the idea here is we're going to give you a very conservative way to set up the environment to avoid these traps and pitfalls. And just remember, so we're going on the path of virtualization now. So the first thing I'd say to you is read the documentation. Sounds common sense, but I've seen a lot of DBAs who get themselves into trouble because it was so easy to install the VMware product suite. Read the documentation and read the storage array documentation. Very, very important, right? The other thing is there are support groups out there. Anybody ever heard of SQL Saturday? Right, they charge you the cost of a lunch and they run 5 to 7 tracks on all things concerning Microsoft for usually it's about $8 for the day. Absolute no-brainer if you're serious about implementing Microsoft's technology.
yeah, if you're a SQL DBA, this is a great way to get training, right? Great way to training. Or you want to learn more about SQL, this is a great event to go to.
All right. The other thing, if you're an Oracle DBA, the IOUG, the Independent Oracle Users Group, has literally just started a VMware SIG. Brand new, it was launched at the conference. Right? Mr. Webster is one of the top virtualization blogs in the world. And the entry price is free. Right? As long as you get an internet connection and a browser, there's no cost to learning from all his experience. We'd rather you buy the book, certainly, but if you can't buy the book, then at least go there. Right? My company, I have a useful links section. I'm constantly updating it with different user groups and things.
So where do we start, right? When we start down this path of virtualization, what we want to do is we want to have a plan. It sounds like Mike said common sense, but there's a reason that a lot of this stuff is in the deck, because while it sounds like common sense, sometimes customers, and we've just, we get moving so fast, sometimes we don't take a chance to step back and just plan things out. So this is just a checklist to get you started of things to think about.
Licensing. Can anybody get straight the licensing from a vendor? And it changes, and it is going to impact your world, so understand. How are you going to back it up? Think about these things. Have a plan. By the way, interesting, so we do performance health checks all over the United States, and actually do them all over the world. We probably do about 35 database health checks a quarter. We've been doing them for about 5-6 years. What's the likelihood of your SQL Server database backups not working? Any guesses? Based on doing this for 5 years, probably 150 of them a year. Over 60% of the time, the database backups don't work. So when I hear people, you've got a backup, I don't believe it. Yeah, lots of things have changed, right? The other thing is high availability, right? You've got to ask the questions. Oracle RAC's great technology. I love it. Do you think a paint store has to run Oracle RAC? Do you think if the system went down for 20 minutes, Children's Hospital, I was the first person in the world to deploy Oracle RAC. It was called Oracle 6.2, but we were in a hospital. We couldn't go down. It made perfect sense to me. So my point is, you got to figure out what the right technology is and mix the technology. If you really never can go down, then put vSphere and Oracle RAC together and even make it better. And then I always challenge people, so if you had 3 days in a row you were down, which you met your SLA requirement, 99% uptime, do you think management would be happy with you? I don't think so.
It's a funny story. I was talking to somebody, and their CIO came in and said, hey, we're going to have 5 nines, and that's what we need to architect it for. And the individual was looking at the piece of paper and realized that the CIO had 5 nines after the decimal point. And he said, can I have $1 billion to do this? Because that's about what this is going to cost. So.
And then this is common sense. If your physical infrastructure does not perform well, why would you think virtualizing it is going to perform well? Garbage in, garbage out. So unless something's changed, and I always pick on the politicians, we keep doing things the same way, and then we're surprised we get the same results. And by the way, I'm from Massachusetts. We keep voting the same people in, and then we're not happy about what they do. Well, who's the fool at that point? Right? Baseline, baseline, baseline. Understand the resource requirements of the database.
And it's important to baseline before you go down this journey. And the reason for that is you got to work with the DBAs and the infrastructure team and come together with a key set of KPIs. And you do that while it's physical, right? Do that, make sure you're catching, month-end business cycles and spikes. And the reason you do that is so that when you virtualize it, you have something to look back at. So when the call comes in, and tell me if anyone's ever gotten this call, yeah, it's slow. Right?
Oh, actually, it's the database is slow.
You have something to look at. You have some baselines, and you can look at something quickly and understand, hey, we're within 5% of all these metrics, it's something else. Or maybe one of these KPIs is gone off into left field or spiked, and you've not only been able to identify it, but right, it's all troubleshooting is all about trying to figure out where the problem is faster. So by having that information, you're able to go figure out what it is. Maybe it's the network or something, and dive into that faster than if you didn't have any of this information and you're starting from ground zero.
I'll give a classic example. We had $1 billion vendor. I can't tell you who they are, but you would know the company. And they went and bought all new hardware, new storage array, and they started to migrate just the Oracle E-Business Suite application onto the new hardware. They hadn't brought anything else over, and everything got slower. And they went back to the storage array vendor, they went back to all the vendors, and nobody could give them an answer. So then they somehow made it to us, and I said, well, it's $10,000, 2 weeks, and I'll give you an answer. And I said, and if your children are ugly, I'll tell you your children are ugly. The guy looks at me and says, how could you possibly give me an answer when all these other vendors can't? I said, well, I've been doing it for 30 years, my people are really good, and we frankly have a methodology, and it ain't rocket science. So then we went back and we looked at the systems, and I was looking for that needle in the haystack, like the BIOS setting, right? Well, the new storage array was slower than the old storage array. Gee, I wonder why the database got slower. And I said to him, your kids are ugly. He goes, what do you mean? I said, any DBA worth their salt should have figured this one out. This is like DBA 101. This is like training pants DBA time, right? And then I said, and here's what you need to do. And he was mad at me because I told him his children were ugly. And so, by the way, I've learned, never tell somebody the kids are ugly, even if they are. All right? Please, don't do it. And I said, I'm really not trying to be rude, and you can do business with whoever you want. I said, but your staff is incapable of implementing these changes until you send them back to DBA 101 school, because they still have the DBA training wheels on. Well, he calls me back 2 weeks later and says, get in here and implement the things. But we baselined, we understood, and then we could do a delta on the difference, and it pretty quickly pointed out where the issue was. So I call it the IT food groups: disk, CPU, storage, and memory. And when you baseline these things, right, an hour sample is a terrible sampling point for a database. Too much happens in an hour. And as Jeff said, right, don't pick the time when everything's running great to baseline. Try to find the worst possible time to baseline the system. You want to understand that system under stress and size appropriately. So I would argue 15 seconds or less. Right? And there are tools. I mean, I think VMware's got a great set of tools to help you do this. There are great third-party vendors out there that help you do this. Oracle's got standard tools that help you do this.
And so here's just another chart for you, things to think about as you go through your projects. The one we do want to call out on your right is security. What we're seeing is a lot of customers doing is they would go buy, right, the biggest, baddest hardware as a DBA, and they would say, this is the server I need, frankly, because it's the biggest one on the market, right? And this one's going to last me 5 years. And we get it in, we install the database, it starts running for 3 months, everyone's happy. And then the phone rings. Hey, we got a project and we need somewhere to put this database. You have room. And that slowly happens over the course of a year, and all of a sudden that server is now full. And I've got internal apps, third-party apps, depending on the industry you're in, potentially HIPAA or high-tech apps or PCI. I've got all these databases now sitting on the same server, and the compliance officer walks over and says, are we compliant? Or in the SQL world, I can patch to an instance level, and you have some third-party vendor that hasn't certified their app to that version of SQL that you have to patch. Now your database, right, that may be running, or that instance that may be running a mission, right, critical, database for your organization is now, right, potentially at risk because some third-party vendor won't certify that patch you need to put down. So what we're seeing is customers are looking at their databases and they're saying, this is an opportunity for me to take what's in the physical world and part of my project, realign this in the virtual world. So I'm going to break these instances down and create, database, in the virtual world that all my PCI go on this, or all my, anything that needs this particular regulation will go on this database. So it's something else just to think about as you go through these projects.
And the other thing, just to illustrate, is a common thing is the DBAs on a physical world are used to having access to all the data of what's going on in the system and the database. In the virtual world, right, you've got the hypervisor between them and all that information. Make sure you share it with them, right? And so then this is an argument, if you're going to go down this path, you really should be moving towards this path of what we'll call database as a service. And there's lots of ways you can implement this. I think it's a good slide to look at later. The interesting thing is when you baseline, you have to understand the workload requirements. There's a few pages of charts that focus on the different areas and important metrics that you should look at, and some guidance in some of those metrics. The book goes into it in a lot more detail.
Yeah, so real quick on this one. This is from ESX Top, right? So device average, K average, because I'm sure you're going to remember this, right, a week from now. K average is the amount of time it takes the ESX kernel to process the I/O. Right? So what you'll see is general applications, 2 is okay. For databases, right? I lost the argument of putting 0 in there, so we put 1. But for me, I don't want the kernel to be the reason your database is slow, but 1 is okay. Right? And the other one, D average, is device average. So that's round trip from the time the I/O leaves the HBA, goes to your SAN array and back. 10 is the industry standard, right? And 10's okay. And with these, it's okay if they spike. So when you're looking at those numbers, it's okay if they go up and down, right? That's just the read-write going on underneath the cover. What you want to watch for is if, for example, device average stays up high. So if it's at 40 and it's hanging at 40 for a while, what that's telling you is, right, the I/O left the ESX host and took 4 times as long as it should have to come back. Where do you think the problem is? Probably outside the ESX box, right? So, look at those 2 numbers, right? There's some good articles on there on how to look at them, right? So if device average is low, but your kernel average is high, you may have a queuing problem. So you want to look into the queues, right? So 2 numbers, 5-minute troubleshooting guide to help you identify the problem, right? Where do I start looking, in the box or outside of the box?
And so what you'll see is there's a few slides that go over a bunch of things that we think you should be looking at, especially when you're baselining, with some guidance on what we think are reasonable numbers on average.
And these are meant as starting points, right? Work with the DBAs in your organization. They may have different numbers they look at or want these to be at different values.
Right? I/O is always something you want to take a hard look at. This is kind of an example of doing that. There's an example of a free script that somebody created for analyzing the I/O that's pretty useful. These are a bunch of tools that you can use to look at I/O. One of my favorites is Slob, silly little Oracle benchmarking tool, right? These are freebies. If you choose to use the Oracle tool, this is some guidance. Go back, look at the slide later, right? And the other thing we talked about and we kind of allude to is you're working as a team to support this environment. And the people you're working with flunked mind reading. So you have to talk, you have to share information. What does the database need? Right? And also the storage administrators and everybody else have to keep in mind that it is a shared environment and remind the DBA that there are other people on the host. And it's not just about the database. Right? I'll let you, this is one of my favorite slides, the Jeff rule.
So this is the check it before you wreck it. And in the deck, there's information on how to do this. But for the VMware admins, when you're building and you're working with the DBAs and the SAN team and the IOPS and the throughput come back and say you need to build a VM that can do 20,000 IOPS, right? In the deck, we show you how to do it with Iometer, where you can sample, right? Simulate the workload type, right? OLTP or warehouse type workload, and test it, right? Before you hand it over to the DBA, right? So if you do the test and it comes back with 25,000 IOPS, you can hand it to the DBA and say, hey, I tested it, we're good. The subsystem can support, right, your database. Here's evidence of that. So when the database administrator comes back and says, yeah, it's slow, both of you can walk into the developer's office and say, it's not us, it's you.
All right. And just so you know, we're going to have to speed it up a little bit. So just really quick, there's always this question of P to Vs. We really would rather see you build a new environment out that's going to host the database and do a clean install if you can. It'll avoid a lot of problems. We talked about database as a service. Well, part of that is being able to do things unattended, and these are examples of ways you can do that, right? So you can be at the VMworld party and know that the work's already happening while you're not there.
We took that picture from last night, by the way.
So if you have a support issue, one of the things I like on the Oracle side, specifically with VMware, is you can call their support team, and there are Oracle specialists, and they can coordinate with Oracle to help you if you're getting people passing the bullet on, you know, the ball on who really is the problem.
So to be clear, if you are running Oracle databases on VMware and you have an issue, you can call VMware support. In the notes, say this is an Oracle database on VMware, and can you please engage the Oracle specialist team? Okay? If we will work to tell you if it is a VMware issue or an Oracle issue. If it's an Oracle issue, we're not going to close the ticket either. We're going to keep the ticket open until it is resolved. So this isn't just us passing the buck. We want to work with our customers because we believe the best place to run these databases is on vSphere. I think that's pretty cool. I don't know another company that does that.
And the other thing, there's always is what should be the guidelines when I'm installing a database? The same as physical. VMware does not change the OS stack in any way. The database works and behaves the same way when it's virtualized, right? So if your OS and database don't know they're virtualized, don't tell them, right? I'll let you do this.
Yeah, so understand the workload type. You have your OLTP, your batch, or your extract, transact, load, or your DSS, or your warehouse type workloads. Understand these workloads, understand their patterns. Here's just some high-level observations of what they look like. And the reason you want to do that, understand when these workloads run. For customers, right, we see the OLTPs a lot of times. Now, some shops are 24/7, and this may not apply, but a lot of times we'll see OLTP workloads run while, you know, during production hours, 8 to 5 type thing, and batch tend to run at night. Well, what if I, through the magic of awesome Photoshop skills, combine these two workloads on the same host? Now I'm driving that utilization of that host higher, right? So my return on investment for that hardware is now better.
And so just keep in mind, when you first went down the path of virtualization, it was all about capacity, not performance. The database is about performance. I would love to see you be able to separate them onto different physical hosts if possible, but that's certainly not a necessity. I'm old school. I'd rather see the environment separated, right? We're at a halfway point. We're running about 4 minutes behind schedule, which is good. And so we always like to do trivia questions to break it up. So anybody know where the first documented use of the word nerd is? We've all heard the word. Please, shut it out. Dr. Seuss, were you here last year? Pretty good. All right, and then the other one, easy one. Which occasion did North Americans on average eat the most food? Easter, wrong. Thanksgiving, I thought you might say, wrong. No. Super Bowl, correct.
Super Bowl, there you go.
And of course, as a Patriots fan, you notice that Mr. Brady is laughing at who getting sacked. I can't help myself.
See how he slides these things in on me? Yeah. It was a picture of Johnny Manziel, I'm just saying.
The thing to keep in mind, I would argue that you should take your database instances, your production database instances, and have more VMs versus less VMs because you can tune down to the VM level resources. So rather than have one giant monster VM that might have 5 or 6 instances housed in it or one massive database, smaller can be better because you have a better granularity on how to tune things.
Yeah, sometimes we say, well, you know, from a DBA perspective, the one on the right means a lot more work. But think about it. If I have 100 databases on one VM or one physical box and that goes down, how many application owners are calling you? 100. What if I had broke that into 4 VMs? While it may be a little bit more management, if something happens inside that OS, that's 25 phone calls versus 100. And we are seeing the one on the right. As customers virtualize, sometimes they do come in, both are valid, with the one on the left, but eventually they do move to that model that's on the right, to take advantage of the scale-out hardware and scale-wide. So that's what we're seeing, but both are valid.
And so basically, this is just a recap slide, just for the sake of catching up a little time. Storage, I have to point this out, there's two philosophies, Mr. Webster being one, and the authors of the Oracle book being Don Sullivan. Your storage is just a set of containers for your database. The US perspective, the New Zealand perspective, your database is just an extension of your storage. Okay? The fundamental relationship between storage doesn't change, right? A database is an I/O hog.
So you know, just something to keep in mind, right? One of the advantages of virtualization, I got a physical server, I got two HBAs going back to the array. Is this pretty common for your environment? All right, so let's take that same server, virtualize, throw ESX on it, and now I create VMs. And I have the ability to do 4 PV-SCSI controllers. I just gave you an answer to the VCP test, per VM, right? So now what did I just do to the number of I/O paths for Windows? I doubled it, right? So now Windows has 4 more paths in which to queue up and send I/O out. When I start stacking these VMs on the same host, something I need to be careful of, right? Anyone spot the bottleneck? If you can't, step away from the keyboard, please.
Yes.
Right? But the idea here is understand the entire stack of your infrastructure, right? Because you can stack these VMs and they can do a lot. vSphere 5.5, we can do over 1 million IOPS out of one virtual machine, right? So understand the infrastructure, understand where the bottlenecks can be, and architect appropriately.
And then there's this age-old argument, is RDMs better than the native VMware, VMS? The performance is about the same.
So VMware Performance Engineering will say, don't let performance be the reason you go VMFS or RDM. The answer is, are you doing something like SQL clustering with shared disk? So FCI, for those that are running 2012, right? If you are, then you have to use RDMs, or your backup tool requires you, right, to use the RDM. Those are some reasons to use RDMs.
The other thing we like to talk about is thin provisioning, is what I call the first write penalty. Anything that slows down the database, we try to avoid. So we would recommend that you use eagerthix 0, and there's examples here on how to do that. You can go back and look at later.
So that's important, and the idea here is when ESX writes to a block on the storage, we actually write a 0 the first time, and then we write the data. For general workloads, not a big deal. But if I got a database, I'm going to be doing a bunch of, I'm going to go, I don't know, right into a log file, a bunch of continuous writes. If I got to write a 0 in the data, 0 data, that's a performance hit. So what we can do is we can eager 0 thick the VMDK file, pre-0 it, right? So basically that option is going, when you deploy the VMDK file ahead of time, it's going to pre-0 the entire VMDK file. Now, don't go run out and do this to every VM in your environment. It's unnecessary. And even within your databases, there's going to be 2 guidances here. One, you only need to do it where the I/O sits. So tempdb, logs, database, right? You don't need to do it to the OS and binary volume. And the other thing too is work with your storage vendor to understand VAAI primitives that your storage array supports. Because some storage arrays will do things like drop the first 0 they see from VMware. So you may not even need to do the eager 0 thick, right? So work with your storage vendor. They'll give you some guidance on that. And the other thing is if you're going to be doing this, don't do, say, 100 gigs worth of eager 0 thick in the middle of the day. Yeah. That's what we call an RGE, or resume generating event. Okay? This is just something... Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, sure. Microsoft recommends 1 data file per CPU. I would argue with the newer versions, right? We try to do lowest common denominator. SQL Server's gotten more efficient, so you don't necessarily, it's a guidance more than anything else.
Yeah, so there's a couple schools of thoughts here. This is where you want to work with companies like Mike that have deep DBAs that can work with you in your environment to give you the appropriate recommendation for your environment with the versions of SQL you're running, the OS you're running, the hardware you're running on, etc.
right? Paravirtual drivers are good. They will just speed up performance. As you can see, this is a good example. Greater throughput, lower CPU. There's no downside to using it. Just use the most current version, right? Once again, 80% of your problems happen in the storage layer, right? Misconfigured, missized, misused.
So that stat comes out of VMware GSS, right?
And then we talked about the basic relationship hasn't changed.
Yeah.
Let me just see if there's understand the multipathing to the drives is very important. And once again, anything you can do to optimize storage is going to have a great impact on the database. Hyperthreading. Does a hyperthreading look like an extra CPU to you? It's not. It's better than a single CPU. And so one of the common things is you have to figure out how many virtual CPUs you have. And so I always say to people, don't think of a hyperthreaded CPU as 2. I'd argue it's about a 20% uplift on average. So we like to say maintain a 1-to-1 ratio between physical CPUs and virtual CPUs, but you do get a little bit of an uplift from a hyperthreading. Don't leave it on, use it, but just understand it's not an additional CPU.
And this is for your production databases. This isn't for your tier 2, tier 3 test dev type databases where a little bit of overcommitment's okay. And the other thing is make sure before you do any changes, as we said earlier, do this over a business cycle before you start to add additional servers in.
And I would also tell you, as you get comfortable with things, overcommitment's an okay strategy, but do not do it out of the gate, and certainly not till you understand what your production databases really need. This is an interesting slide that talks about within the VM. So the guest operating system sees a number of allocated vCPUs, and the non-virtualized OS would see the hyperthreads. So just keep in mind how the relationship works. This is kind of a nice bring it all back together slide, and with a reminder looking at the power saving features. Let you read that later. I just want to pick up a little time. Memory.
So this is the min-max settings, right? This is for the DBAs in the room, right? Or work with your DBAs. Before you modify these settings, please understand the implications of what they can do, because if you don't set it right, you may prevent SQL from starting. So
this is a chart that kind of translates that will kind of get you to the right place on average within the context of the VM itself, not within the context of the whole host. There's always this question of which should you use. You have 2 ways of setting it up. We'll save you the trouble. I go back to my DBAs. We're a company full of DBAs, and everyone, and we're very clear, our experience has always taught it, just use option 1.
And so this is if you're running multiple instances of SQL on one VM, right? And the reason that Mike's DBAs like it is because if you look in the pro-con chart, the pro is when a new process or instance starts, there's memory available. Whereas if you do it with the min, if you look at the con, whenever something starts, the DBA has to go and free something up. So would you rather have something start, or would you rather have to start something and go free something up before it actually starts running? So most people defer and like option 1 for that reason. So lock pages in memory. So this is important. This is on as it says. What you need to do is give it the rights. So take your SQL service accounts, because we're all running service accounts with SQL, right? So give it this right. This is a performance tweak or a performance booster for you. And then there's the link to the Microsoft article if you need more information.
And some versions, it's automatically set up that way. NUMA is an interesting one, and I really like this diagram because I think it really drives home the concept. So think of NUMA as associated with a set of CPU sockets. And if you can get your VM to fit within that NUMA cache, you will get optimal memory. If it doesn't, it's going to use the cross connects to go elsewhere. And so by aligning with NUMA, you can get optimal performance. And I'm using a really simple example here of a 4-socket, 6-core system, 4 NUMA nodes, 128 gig. That says that each NUMA node is 32 gig minus the overhead of managing NUMA itself. If you have to span NUMA, it's okay, it is efficient, but it's certainly not as efficient. And this is one of those we'll talk about, like 5% performance boost. And the other thing is the home NUMA node gets established when the VM first starts up. right? When it first starts up and can't be changed.
So ever wonder, like when you're configuring a VM and it has the cores per socket, what should you put, right? Hit the drop down, should you align it? So if you leave that to the default value of 1, what happens is we'll look actually at the physical NUMA configuration and map that to the VM. So, and that's set at boot time and that stays. And so why this is important is because if you would vMotion to a hardware with a different NUMA configuration that may not align with it, you could run into a performance problem. And so this is where we'll say, if you can, leave it at the default of 1, because 3 years from now, are you going to remember to go back and change that setting to align with the underlying NUMA infrastructure, right? If it's set to 1 every time the VM boots, it's going to look down at the NUMA infrastructure, NUMA architecture underneath it, and if it needs to change, it will change. If you go in and change that cores per socket to a specific number, that will be locked in. So we can talk about that more later.
And then the other thing is if you use hot add CPU, it disables NUMA.
Yeah.
So these
VNUMA.
things are all, yeah, VNUMA, thank you. All right. The other thing is understand that swapping happens in 2 places, at the VM level and the host level.
So one thing about VNUMA is VNUMA exposes NUMA to the virtual machine, right? Thus, the Windows operating system and applications inside of it, or RHEL, can view the underlying infrastructure. SQL is very, very good at using NUMA, so that's a good thing, right? But when we start talking to our counterparts on the Oracle side, well, not so much. And they'll talk about leaving, Mike Webster can go into it, talk about letting vSphere handle the NUMA, because vSphere has been supporting NUMA since version 2.5.
So we're stating the obvious: ballooning, memory compression, swapping slow you down, right? Ballooning is one of these things that's supposed to help you when you're having memory contention. It happens when the physical host is experiencing memory. What's interesting is that the balloon driver runs on the individual VM itself and then communicates back to free up memory where needed. There's always this classic illustration of the balloon driver and how it works. But the idea here is if it's having problems with memory, this is one of those mechanisms that's going to kick in to try to be more efficient. So don't shut it off. There's always been this guidance about shutting it off. Please don't shut it off. Leave it alone. It's far better for you than the alternative of swapping. This is kind of a cute, quick one, which basically says...
It's a picture of my kids.
Yeah. How many VMs can I put on a host? As many whose active memory will fit, right? Well, how do you determine active memory? You've got this formula, but one of the nice things about vSphere is it does transparent page sharing. When it's having memory contention, it will start looking at how memory is being used and dedupe. So if you have like operating systems on the same host, it's smart enough to say, hey, I don't need to have 5 copies of this operating system out here.
In memory.
Right, in memory. And so before ballooning, it's always running, and once again, it's looking for opportunities to reclaim so that things will run. And this is when it's experiencing a problem. When you build the VMs, keep them as lean as possible. Remember we talked about NUMA nodes? Well, one of the ways to make sure you fit within a NUMA node is to make sure the VM is as lean and mean as possible. You want to do?
Yeah, so memory reservations. So if you have that mission critical database that you're worried about, the balloon driver coming in and stealing memory from, if you set a reservation for that VM, right, that reservation is, right, if other VMs need money, it's kind of like money, right? So if they need the memory, they will not touch what's in that reservation, right? So a lot of DBAs say, oh my gosh, I'm going into this shared environment. Well, if I set a memory reservation for that VM, and this memory is dedicated to this database, and I follow, right, that 1-to-1 virtual CPU to core ratio rule, how much of it is it really shared anymore?
So set the appropriate reservations to guarantee the physical memory for the VM for those mission-critical workloads.
The only thing is when you do start setting reservations, remember that does change your strict access control. Right? Duncan Epping has a really great blog on when we start talking slot sizes versus percentages for how we determine HA with strict access control. So read that, right, and understand what changing and setting reservations will do.
So this is a good Oracle example, right? Figure out what the OS needs, figure out what the database needs, and that would be a good place to reserve memory if you feel it's important in that situation. I actually love this example because it demonstrates that when you have a temporary file and you've got a memory reservation, it creates it at 0. It knows it's never going to use it because it's always going to have the memory it needs. Large pages are interesting because they don't normally swap out, but if the machine is having real performance problems, it will actually take large pages, break them into small pages, and then swap them out, which is clearly more expensive, but large pages are good things. If you use, or Oracle, they call them huge pages. This is a cheat sheet you can use to help you figure out how to set it up.
So this is just how you set the large pages inside SQL Server?
So we may make it, I'm not sure. So this is kind of a summary slide. I'm going to let you read that later because we're going to run out of time if we're not careful. Let's top the network. Jumbo frames, the default is 1,500 bytes. Anybody know why 1,500 bytes? Because in the old networks, anything faster than that didn't work. And that's why it's been set to this day. But we had this ability to go up to 9,000 bytes. And when you have a database that's moving data, do you want to move it quickly in big chunks, or do you want to have a little bicycle moving a little bit of data at once? So jumbo frames are a really good thing to help performance. If you want to know that it's working, there's a quick ping command you can use. And I would argue that the optimal setting is 8192, and you can kind of see how I got there with the 9,000 bytes minus the overhead. Computers like nice round numbers.
And the reason Mike likes to argue that is because that's what Microsoft says it should be. If you look at the link at the bottom, and this is how you set it inside SQL.
Right? If your network doesn't support it end-to-end and you have a restriction point, you're going to get yourself in trouble. So make sure that the network can support it end-to-end. This is a really good summary slide, but one of the things that you'll notice on this is you now have faster networks, and so in some of the sub-bullets you'll see some guidance if you're using some of the faster bandwidth.
Yeah, so if you're on vSphere 5.0 or later, really consider using multiple NICs for vMotion, as well as make sure you're using the VMXNet3 driver inside the guest OS.
Right? The cluster validation was that I see more people that get in trouble with Windows clusters and they haven't run the tool. We just had this happen with a customer, and the first thing we did, we got in and we ran the tool and it told us the cluster wasn't set up properly. So it's there.
Somebody paid you to do that?
I'm sorry, what? It's like we went in and we said we would like to run the cluster validation tool. Oh, guess what? It's not working. They were actually using equipment that wasn't supported by Microsoft. And once you got the right equipment, guess what? Everything worked great. And in fact, if you change your cluster, run it again. Just put it in a file cabinet. Have it ready.
It is something when you call Microsoft support, they can ask for, right? So have it ready just before you open up a ticket.
Yeah, I just do want to point out there is an Oracle book coming out. The authors are excellent. I would highly recommend the book. Good, we made it. 174 slides, 6 minutes left. Thank you for coming in on the last day of the conference at lunchtime.
Yeah.
I always feel bad, but my job is to keep track of the time and move it along so we can at least get through the material, because I think there's nothing worse than getting to a section that somebody wanted to hear and we never get to it. We're here if you have questions, just come on up.